The great doors of the Ash Grove Hall slammed open, and the entire court fell silent in half a second, because nobody kept the Alpha King waiting, and nobody dared to enter that hall without an invitation, except the guard who now stood there gasping for breath, his uniform torn at the shoulder. Cale Ashgrove rose from his throne before the guard even spoke a word. The choosing ceremony had barely started. 12 noble daughters stood in a line before him, each one holding a gift meant to prove she deserved to be his queen, and yet in one heartbeat every eye in the hall turned away from silk and gold and toward the trembling guard at the entrance. "Speak," Cale said, his voice low and sharp, the voice of a king who had learned long ago that softness could get a person killed. "The northern border," the guard managed, "riders came through the tree line an hour ago. Not ours." A murmur spread through the crowd like water finding cracks in stone. Lady Sable, standing near the front in a gown the color of dried blood, narrowed her eyes and glanced toward the king with something close to satisfaction, as if trouble at the border might somehow work in her favor. Cale raised one hand, and the room went quiet again. "How many riders?" "6, maybe 7. They didn't cross the line. They watched, and then they left. It was not an attack. Not yet. But in the Ashgrove lands, watching was often the first step before something worse." Cale had grown up hearing stories of packs that ignored the first riders and paid for it later with burned villages and empty homes. His own father used to say that peace was only ever a pause between dangers, never the absence of them. "Double the watch on the northern fence line," Cale ordered. "Send word to Elder Garrick. I want a full report before nightfall." The guard bowed and disappeared through the doors as quickly as he had come. For a moment, Cale simply stood there, one hand resting on the arm of his throne, his jaw tight, his eyes distant, as if part of him had already left the hall and gone north to stand at that fence line himself. This was the weight nobody saw when they looked at a young Alpha King draped in fine clothing and surrounded by wealth. They saw the crown. They never saw the sleepless nights, the constant calculation, the fear that one wrong decision could cost hundreds of lives. Lady Sable cleared her throat gently, just loud enough to remind the king that 12 women were still standing before him, each one holding gifts that had taken months, sometimes years, to gather. "My king," she said, stepping forward with practiced grace, "shall we continue the choosing? The border has capable men to guard it. This hall needs your attention now." Cale looked at her for a long moment. There was something about the way she said it, so smooth, so certain, that made him feel like a piece being moved across a board rather than a man making his own decisions. He had felt that way often since his coronation. Everyone around him seemed to want something, and very few of them seemed to care what he actually wanted. He sat back down. "Continue," he said, and the ceremony resumed as though nothing had happened at all, though the tension from the north still hung in the air like smoke that refused to clear. One by one, the noble daughters approached the throne. Lady Sable went fast, presenting a bolt of silk so fine it seemed to move like water in the torchlight, dyed a deep purple that only the wealthiest families could afford. She spoke of alliances her family could offer, soldiers her father could send, gold that could fill the treasury for a decade. Cale thanked her with the same practiced politeness he had used 100 times before, and she stepped back into the line with a confident smile, certain she had done enough. The next woman brought a chest of gold coins so heavy it took 2 servants to carry it. Another brought jewels mined from her family's own land, each one large enough to buy a small village. A woman from the Eastern Territory brought a written promise of grain shipments for the next 5 winters, an offer that made several elders nod with approval, since food mattered more than gold when the cold months came. Cale listened to each one. He nodded at the right moments. He asked polite questions when required. But there was a hollow feeling behind his eyes that none of them seemed to notice, or perhaps none of them cared to notice, because to them, this ceremony was not about the man on the throne at all. It was about position. It was about power. It was about which family would rise and which would be left behind. He had known this would happen. He had known it since the day his father died, and the elders reminded him, gently but firmly, that an Alpha King without a queen was seen as unfinished, unstable, unfit to hold a territory as large as Ashgrove. Marriage, for a king, was rarely about love. It was a transaction disguised in ceremony, and Cale had accepted that truth the way he accepted the cold in winter, without joy, but without complaint either. By the time the ninth woman finished her presentation, Cale found himself staring past her shoulder, toward the tall windows at the side of the hall, where afternoon light spilled across the stone floor in long golden lines. He thought of the northern fence line. He thought of his father, who used to walk that same fence every morning before the sun rose, checking every post, every gate, trusting no one else with the task. He thought of how tired he already felt, and the ceremony was not even finished. Then a small commotion near the back of the hall pulled his attention away from the window. A young woman stood near the entrance, dressed far more simply than the others in the line. Her dress was a plain gray, clean but clearly worn many times before, the kind of dress meant for work rather than display. She carried nothing in her hands that anyone could see, no chest, no silk, no jewels, and this alone was enough to draw curious glances and quiet laughter from a few of the noble daughters who noticed her. An attendant near the door tried to stop her, whispering something urgent, but the young woman shook her head and said something back, quiet but firm enough that the attendant eventually stepped aside with a confused shrug. Cale watched this exchange with mild interest, grateful for anything that pulled his mind away from the weight sitting on his chest. "Who is that?" he asked one of the elders standing near his throne. Elder Garrick, an older wolf with silver hair and sharp eyes, followed the king's gaze and frowned slightly. "I don't recognize her, my king. She's not on the list of noble daughters." "Then how did she get through the doors?" "I have her removed." "No," Cale said, surprising even himself with the speed of his answer. "Let her stay. I want to see what she wants." The 10th woman in line finished her presentation, a nervous smile on her face as she stepped back, and then there was a pause, an unusual break in the rhythm of the ceremony, because the next person expected to step forward was not among the noble daughters at all. It was the young woman in grey. Whispers rippled across the hall as she walked forward, her steps steady despite the weight of every eye in the room pressing against her. Lady Sable's mouth curled into something between amusement and disgust, and a few of the noble daughters exchanged glances that clearly said this girl had made a terrible mistake by even entering the hall. Cale sat up slightly straighter on his throne, curious despite himself. The young woman stopped a respectful distance from the throne and bowed, not with the polished elegance of the noble daughters, but with a simple, sincere motion that somehow felt more honest than every gesture that had come before it. "Name," Cale said. "Ren Corder, my king. I work as a healer's apprentice in the outer village, under Clara Whitfield." A ripple of quiet laughter passed through some of the onlookers. A healer's apprentice, standing among noble daughters, at the choosing ceremony of the Alpha King. It seemed almost absurd. Cale raised a hand, and the laughter stopped instantly. "You have no gift to present," he said, though it was not quite a question. "I have something, my king. Though I understand if it is not what you expect." "Show me." Ren reached into a small pocket sewn into the side of her dress and pulled out a single folded piece of paper, old and soft at the edges from years of handling, the kind of paper that had clearly been unfolded and refolded more times than anyone could count. She stepped forward and offered it to him with both hands. Cale took it, his brow furrowing slightly at the strange, almost delicate way she handled something so plain. He unfolded it carefully, and for a moment, the entire hall seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see what could possibly compare to silk and gold and promises of grain. It was a drawing. A child's drawing, done in faded crayon, showing a large wolf and a small boy standing beneath a tree with crooked, twisting branches. The lines were uneven, the colors messy in the way only a young child could manage, but there was something achingly familiar about the shape of that tree, about the way the boy in the drawing stood with one hand raised toward the wolf beside him. At the bottom corner, in shaky, careful letters, someone had written a name. Cale. The hall around him seemed to fade into silence and distance, as though someone had pulled a curtain between him and the world. His fingers tightened slightly on the edges of the paper. He had not seen this drawing in 20 years. He had not thought about it in 20 years, not consciously, though some part of him, some quiet corner of his memory, had never truly forgotten the crooked oak tree behind his childhood home, or the hours he used to spend there with his mother before everything changed. "Where did you get this?" he asked, and his voice, usually so controlled, carried the smallest crack. Ren met his eyes steadily, without fear, though he could see the effort it took her to hold that gaze. I found it years ago, my king, tucked inside an old storybook at the schoolhouse in the outer village. Your mother taught there, before she passed. I didn't know whose drawing it was until your coronation, when I saw your face clearly for the first time and recognized the boy in the picture. The hall remained silent, though Kale could feel the weight of dozens of eyes shifting between him and the paper in his hands, trying to understand what was happening, trying to understand why the Alpha King, who had sat through gold and silk and promises with a distant, unreadable expression, now looked as though the ground beneath his throne had quietly shifted. He looked up at Ren again, searching her face for some trace of ambition, some hint of calculation, the kind of look he had grown used to seeing on the faces of the noble daughters throughout the entire ceremony. He found none of it. Only a quiet, careful honesty, and something that looked almost like hope, though hope for what, he could not yet say. You kept this, he said slowly, for years, without knowing who it belonged to. I couldn't bring myself to throw it away, my king. It felt like it belonged to someone, and someone might one day want it back. Somewhere behind her, Lady Sable's expression had shifted from amusement to something colder, sharper, though she said nothing, choosing instead to watch the scene unfold with narrowed, calculating eyes. Kale looked down at the drawing again, at the shaky crooked lines of that oak tree, at the small boy with his hand raised toward the wolf, and for the first time since the ceremony began, the tightness in his chest loosened, just slightly, just enough for him to breathe. The northern border could wait a few more minutes. The silk and the gold and the grain promises could wait as well. For the first time in longer than he could remember, something in that hall felt real. Elder Garrick, Kale said, his voice steady again, though something new had entered it, something the elder standing near him had not heard in a very long time. Yes, my king. Postpone the remainder of the ceremony. I wish to speak with this young woman alone. A wave of shocked whispers rushed through the hall like wine through dry leaves, and Lady Sable's carefully composed expression cracked just enough to reveal the anger underneath, though she quickly forced it back into place, bowing her head along with the rest of the court. Ren stood perfectly still, the folded drawing now resting safely back in Kale's hands, uncertain whether she had just made the greatest mistake of her life or something far more important, though she would not have to wait long to find out. Kale rose from his throne, the drawing held carefully against his chest, and for the first time since his father's death, he felt something other than the crushing weight of duty pressing down on his shoulders. He felt curious. He felt, for reasons he could not yet fully explain, awake. And as he walked down from the throne toward the quiet, unassuming young woman who had brought him nothing but a piece of paper, the entire hall watched in stunned silence, sensing, though none of them could have said exactly why, that something important had just begun, something none of them could stop, and something none of them had expected when the doors first opened that morning to the sound of silk brushing against marble floors. The private chamber where Kale led Ren was smaller than most people imagined the king's personal room to be, with plain stone walls, a single window overlooking the eastern gardens, and a wooden table that had clearly seen decades of use. It was nothing like the golden hall outside, and Ren suspected that was exactly the point. Kale set the folded drawing down on the table between them and stood there for a long moment without speaking, his hands braced against the wood, his eyes fixed on the faded crayon lines as though he expected them to disappear if he looked away. Sit, he finally said, though his voice had lost the commanding edge it carried in the hall. It sounded almost tired now, almost human. Ren sat carefully in the chair across from him, folding her hands in her lap, unsure whether she was allowed to speak first or whether silence was expected until the king chose to break it. 20 years, Kale said quietly, still staring at the drawing. I haven't seen this in 20 years. I didn't even know it still existed. May I ask about the tree, my king? The one in the drawing. Something flickered across his face, quick and painful, gone before it could fully form into an expression she could name. It grew behind the house where I was raised, before my father moved us into the main keep. A crooked old oak, twisted from a storm that hit it before I was even born. My mother used to say it survived the storm because it learned to bend instead of standing stiff against the wind. He paused, his jaw tightening. She used to read to me under that tree, every evening, no matter how tired she was from teaching all day at the schoolhouse. Ren stayed quiet, sensing that interrupting now would close a door that had only just begun to open. I drew that picture the summer I turned 6, Kale continued. She kept it pinned above her desk at the schoolhouse for years, because she said it was the only portrait anyone had ever made of her as a wolf, even if it was just crayon and terrible proportions. A faint, almost involuntary smile touched his lips, the first genuine smile Ren had seen since entering the hall that morning. I forgot she kept it there. I forgot most things from that time, honestly. What happened to her? Ren asked gently, though she suspected she already knew part of the answer from village stories passed quietly between healers over the years. Kale's smile faded as quickly as it had appeared. She died when I was 8. A sickness that moved through the village that winter, one the healers of that time couldn't stop in time. My father never spoke of her after that. Not once. He had every drawing, every letter, every trace of her softness removed from the keep within a month of her passing. He said grief made a future king weak, and weakness was something Ashgrove blood could not afford. The bitterness in his voice was quiet, controlled, the kind that came from years of practice rather than fresh pain, though Ren could tell the wound beneath it had never fully closed, only scarred over in a way that made it easier to carry. I'm sorry, Ren said softly. That's a heavy thing to lose, and an even heavier thing to lose twice, once when she died, and again when everything that remembered her was taken away. Kale looked up at her then, really looked at her, as though seeing something in her words that surprised him. Most people who hear that story tell me how strong my father was, building a kingdom out of that kind of loss. You're the first person in a long time who's called it what it actually was. I didn't mean to speak out of turn, my king. You didn't, he said quickly. I asked, and you answered honestly. That's rare, in this hall. Everyone else answers the way they think I want to hear, not the way they actually feel. He pulled out the chair across from her fully now and sat down, the drawing still between them on the table, and for a while neither of them spoke, the quiet settling comfortably rather than awkwardly, like two people who had somehow known each other far longer than the length of one strange morning. Tell me about the schoolhouse, Kale said eventually. I remember pieces of it, but I was young, and my memories from before her death are scattered, like broken glass. I only ever see fragments. Ren considered the question carefully before answering, wanting to give him something true rather than something comforting. It's still standing, though it's smaller than most children expect when they first hear stories about it. There's a portrait of her near the entrance, painted by one of the older village artists not long after she passed. The children who study there now don't know much about her personally, only that she was kind, and that she believed every child deserved to learn, whether their family had gold or nothing at all. That sounds like her, Kale murmured, more to himself than to Ren. The book where I found your drawing was one she used often, a collection of old village stories she read aloud to her students. I found it tucked into a supply closet years ago when Clara asked me to help clear out unused materials. The drawing had slipped between two pages near the back, so one it had almost become part of the paper itself. And you kept it all this time. I couldn't bring myself to leave it in that closet, my king. Something about it felt important, even before I understood why. Kale studied her face for a long moment, the kind of look that made Ren feel as though he were trying to memorize something rather than simply observe it. Most people who come before the throne bring me things meant to impress me, he said slowly. Gold that means nothing beyond the weight of it. Silk that will sit in storage the moment the ceremony ends. Promises that exist only to bind my family to theirs. You brought me the only remaining piece of my mother that I know still exists in this world. I didn't bring it to win anything, my king. I only wanted you to have it back. I believe you, Kale said, and there was a quiet certainty in his voice that surprised even him. That's what makes this strange. Everyone in that hall wanted something from me today. You're the only one who gave me something instead. Outside the window, the afternoon light had begun to shift into the deeper gold of early evening, and somewhere beyond the garden walls, Kale could hear the faint sound of soldiers training in the courtyard, a reminder that the world beyond this quiet room continued moving regardless of what happened inside it. May I ask you something, Ren called her? Of course, my king. Why did you come to the ceremony at all? You must have known how it would look, a healer's apprentice standing among noble daughters with nothing but a piece of paper in her hands. Ren considered the question honestly before answering. I almost didn't come. Clara told me it wasn't my place, and she wasn't wrong to worry. But I kept thinking about that drawing sitting in a drawer at home, and how strange it felt to hold on to something that belonged to someone else's childhood without ever giving it back. When I heard the choosing ceremony was happening, I thought, perhaps foolishly, that this might be the only chance I would ever have to return it to you. It wasn't foolish. The court seemed to think otherwise. The court thinks many things, Cale said, a trace of dry humor entering his voice for the first time. Most of them wrong. A quiet knock interrupted them before Wren could respond, and Elder Garrick's voice came through the heavy door, respectful but urgent. My king, forgive the interruption, but word has arrived from the Northern Watch. Cale's expression shifted instantly, the softness that had settled over him during the conversation replaced by the sharp focus Wren had first seen in the hall. Enter. Elder Garrick stepped inside, glancing briefly at Wren with visible curiosity before addressing the king directly. The riders retreated beyond the tree line an hour ago, my king. No further movement has been reported, though the watch commander believes they were scouting our defenses rather than preparing an immediate approach. Cale's jaw tightened, his mind clearly already moving through the possibilities, the strategies, the precautions that would need to be discussed before nightfall. Increase the patrols along the eastern ridge as well, in case this was meant to draw our attention away from a second approach. I want updates every 2 hours until we understand their intentions. Yes, my king. As Elder Garrick turned to leave, his eyes flicked once more toward Wren, and Cale caught the unspoken question in that glance, the silent curiosity about why the king had chosen to spend so much time alone with a healer's apprentice while noble daughters waited outside with silk and gold still in their hands. Once the door closed again, Cale turned back to Wren, the weight of his responsibilities visibly settling back onto his shoulders, though something in his expression remained softer than it had been at the start of the ceremony. I have matters that require my attention now, he said, but I would like to continue this conversation, if you're willing. I am, my king. Cale, he said suddenly. Just Cale, when we speak like this. I've heard enough formal titles for one lifetime. Wren allowed herself the smallest smile. Cale, she repeated softly, testing the name, finding it strangely comfortable despite everything. He picked up the drawing from the table, folding it carefully along its worn creases before tucking it into an inner pocket close to his chest, as though he could not bear to let it out of his sight again so soon after finding it. Thank you, he said quietly, for bringing this back to me. You're welcome, Cale. As she rose to leave the chamber, escorted by a quiet attendant toward the outer halls, Wren could feel the weight of many curious eyes waiting just beyond the door, courtiers and noble daughters alike, all wondering what exactly had happened during those private minutes, and all sensing, without yet understanding why, that the choosing ceremony they had witnessed that morning might not end the way any of them had expected. Behind her, Cale remained standing near the window a while longer, his hand resting over the pocket where the drawing now sat close to his heart, his thoughts pulled between the quiet oak tree of his childhood and the quiet, unassuming woman who had somehow, without meaning to, cracked open a door he thought had been sealed shut for 20 years. News of the private meeting spread through the keep faster than any messenger could have carried it, moving through kitchens and hallways and training yards until, by the time supper was served, every servant and soldier in Ashgrove seemed to know that the king had spent an hour alone with a healer's apprentice while noble daughters waited outside holding gifts worth more than most villages earned in a year. Lady Sable heard the news while sitting in her guest chamber, a cup of untouched tea cooling beside her, and the moment her attendant finished speaking, she rose from her chair with a stillness that felt far more dangerous than any outburst could have been. A healer's apprentice, she repeated slowly, testing the words as though they tasted foul in her mouth. With nothing but a piece of paper. That's what the guards are saying, my lady. The king postponed the rest of the ceremony because of it. Sable turned toward the window, looking out over the training yard where soldiers moved through evening drills, their motions sharp and precise even in the fading light. She had spent 3 years preparing for this ceremony, 3 years building alliances, gathering resources, learning every detail of Ashgrove tradition that might give her an advantage. She had not spent 3 years to lose her position to a girl who apparently owned nothing more valuable than an old drawing. Find out everything about her, Sable said quietly. Where she comes from, who her family is, what she does at that healer's cottage every day. I want to know her better than she knows herself. Her attendant bowed and left quickly, and Sable remained by the window a while longer, her mind already turning through possibilities, considering angles, searching for the thread that would unravel whatever strange spell this Ren Calder had apparently cast over the king in a single afternoon. Meanwhile, in the healer's cottage on the edge of the outer village, Ren returned home to find Clara Whitfield waiting near the door with her arms crossed and an expression that mixed worry with disbelief in equal measure. "You spoke with him alone," Clara said, not quite a question. "He wanted to ask about the drawing." "For an hour." Ren set down the small bag she had carried to the ceremony and sighed, suddenly feeling the exhaustion of the day pressing against her shoulders. "He wanted to know about his mother, Clara. About the schoolhouse. About the tree in the drawing. It wasn't anything improper, if that's what worries you." Clara's expression softened slightly, though the worry remained visible in the lines around her eyes. "That's not what worries me, child. I worry about what happens now. You've drawn attention to yourself in a court that doesn't forgive attention easily, especially attention that threatens the ambitions of women like Lady Sable. I've heard stories about her family, about what they've done to rivals in the past. I only wanted to return the drawing," Ren said, though even as she spoke the words, she knew the situation had already moved beyond something so simple. "I know that. But intentions rarely matter in that world, Ren. Only outcomes matter, and the outcome today was that the king dismissed 12 noble daughters to speak with you instead. Whatever happens next, you should prepare yourself for consequences you didn't ask for." Ren sat down heavily at the small wooden table where she and Clara often shared meals, staring at her hands, thinking back to the quiet chamber where Cale had spoken so openly about his mother, about the tree, about the grief his father had tried to bury beneath duty and discipline. None of that had felt dangerous. It had felt, strangely, like the most honest conversation she'd had with anyone in a very long time. "He asked if I would continue speaking with him," she admitted quietly. Clara's eyebrows rose slightly, though she said nothing at first, choosing instead to sit down across from Ren and study her face carefully. "And what did you tell him?" "I said I was willing." Clara nodded slowly, a mixture of pride and concern settling into her expression. "Then you should know what you're walking into, child. The court will not simply accept a healer's apprentice standing where noble daughters once stood. They'll look for reasons to remove you, and if they can't find real reasons, some of them will invent ones instead." 3 days passed before Ren received her next summons to the keep, delivered not by an official messenger but by a quiet, careful note left at the cottage door, written in Cale's own hand rather than dictated to a scribe. The note asked simply if she would walk with him through the eastern gardens that afternoon, if her duties allowed it. Clara read the note over Ren's shoulder and pressed her lips together tightly, though she said nothing to discourage the visit, understanding perhaps that whatever had begun between the king and her apprentice had already moved beyond anything a warning could stop. The eastern garden stretched behind the keep in careful rows of flowering trees and quiet stone paths, far removed from the noise and formality of the throne hall, and when Ren arrived, she found Cale already waiting near a small fountain, dressed more simply than she had seen him before, without the heavy ceremonial robes that marked him as king. "You came," he said, and there was something almost boyish in the relief that crossed his face. "You asked kindly," Ren replied. It seemed rude to refuse. They walked together along the stone paths, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows through the trees, and for a while their conversation drifted through simple things, the plants growing in the garden, the herbs Ren used most often in her healing work, small details that carried none of the weight of thrones or ceremonies or northern border disputes. "I spoke with Elder Garrick after you left," Cale said eventually, his tone shifting towards something more serious. "He tells me the court is already uneasy about the attention I paid you at the ceremony. I imagined they would be. Does that worry you?" Ren considered the question honestly before answering. "It worries me less than it perhaps should. I've spent my whole life outside the court, Cale. I know how to work hard, how to care for the sick, how to live simply. I don't know how to navigate whispers and schemes, and I suspect that's exactly the kind of battlefield where someone like Lady Sable feels most comfortable." Cale's jaw tightened slightly at the mention of her name. "She's already sent people to ask questions about you in the village. My guards have noticed unfamiliar faces near the healer's cottage over the past 2 days." Ren stopped walking, a flicker of unease crossing her face for the first time since the conversation began. Should I be afraid? I don't think she would risk anything reckless, Cale said carefully, not yet, at least. But I would be lying if I said her ambition wasn't dangerous. She spent years positioning herself for this exact moment, and losing that position to someone she considers beneath her will not sit well with her at all. They resumed walking, slower now, the earlier lightness of the conversation replaced by a quiet seriousness that neither of them tried to dismiss. Why does it matter so much to you? Ren asked eventually. What happens with me? We've spoken twice now. You barely know me. Cale was quiet for a long moment, choosing his words carefully. Because in 3 years as king, nobody has spoken to me the way you did in that chamber. Everyone else calculates their words before they say them, weighing how each sentence might benefit them later. You simply told me the truth, even when the truth was uncomfortable, even when it would have been easier to flatter me instead. That's a small thing to build so much on. Perhaps, Cale admitted. But small things are often the ones that matter most, especially to someone who has spent his entire life surrounded by things that only look valuable from a distance. They reached the edge of the garden where the stone path opened into a small clearing overlooking the northern hills, and Cale paused there, his eyes drifting toward the distant tree line where the mysterious riders had appeared days earlier. The border situation remains unresolved, he said, almost to himself. The scouts saw nothing further, but I don't trust silence from that direction. My father used to say silence before a storm is more dangerous than the storm itself, because silence gives you nothing to prepare for. Do you think there will be conflict? I don't know yet. I hope not. But hope has never been a strategy my father trusted, and I've tried to learn from that, even when it makes me tired in ways I don't always know how to explain. Ren watched him carefully, noticing the way his shoulders carried tension even during a quiet walk through a peaceful garden, the way his eyes never fully relaxed even when his voice softened. You carry a great deal alone, she said gently. It comes with a crown. That doesn't mean it should stay that way forever. Cale turned to look at her then, something unreadable passing across his face, though whatever he might have said in response was interrupted by the sound of hurried footsteps approaching along the garden path. Elder Garrick appeared moments later, slightly out of breath, his expression grave enough that Cale straightened immediately, the softness of the afternoon vanishing from his posture in an instant. My king, forgive the interruption, but Lady Sable has requested an urgent audience. She claims to have information regarding a serious matter involving the healer's apprentice. Ren felt her stomach tighten at the words, though she kept her expression carefully neutral, unwilling to give the elder any additional reason to doubt her. Cale's eyes flicked toward Ren briefly before returning to Garrick, his expression hardening into the same sharp focus she had seen when news arrived about the Northern Riders. What kind of information? She wouldn't say specifically, my king, only that it concerns the drawing presented at the ceremony, and questions about how it was truly obtained. A cold, uneasy feeling settled over Ren, though she forced herself to remain calm, reminding herself that she had told the truth about the drawing from the very beginning, and truth, she hoped, would eventually prove itself stronger than whatever scheme Lady Sable had constructed. Bring her to the private chamber, Cale said finally. I hear what she has to say. As Elder Garrick hurried away to deliver the message, Cale turned back to Ren, his expression apologetic despite the seriousness now settling over the moment. I'm sorry, he said quietly. I had hoped we would have more time before something like this happened. It's all right, Ren said, though her voice carried less certainty than she intended. I only wish I knew what she intended to say. Whatever it is, Cale said firmly, I won't accept accusations without proof. You've given me no reason to doubt you, Ren, and I don't intend to abandon that trust simply because someone with more gold decides to challenge it. Despite the tension gathering in the air around them, Ren felt a small, steady warmth at his words, though she also understood, with the same clarity Clara had warned her about days earlier, that the true test of this fragile new trust between them was only just beginning, and Lady Sable, whatever her scheme might be, would not stop at a single attempt to remove Ren from the king's favor. They walked back toward the keep together in silence, the golden light of late afternoon fading slowly into the deeper shadows of evening, both of them aware that whatever waited in that private chamber would shape everything that followed, for better or for worse. The private chamber felt different this time, colder somehow, though nothing about the room itself had changed since the quiet conversation Kale and Ren had shared their days earlier. Lady Sable stood near the table when they entered, her posture perfectly composed, her expression carrying just enough concern to seem genuine to anyone who didn't know her well. "My king," she said, bowing gracefully, though her eyes flicked briefly toward Ren with something colder beneath the surface. "Thank you for seeing me on such short notice. Elder Garrick tells me you have information regarding the drawing presented at the ceremony," Kale said, taking his seat at the head of the table, his voice giving nothing away. "I do, my king, though it pains me to bring such matters forward." Sable folded her hands neatly in front of her. "I've learned, through careful inquiry, that the drawing may not have been found as innocently as was claimed. A servant who once worked at the schoolhouse came to me with information suggesting the item was taken deliberately, years ago, from your mother's private belongings after her passing, rather than discovered by chance in an old storage closet." The accusation landed heavily in the quiet room, and Ren felt her chest tighten with a mixture of shock and disbelief. "That isn't true," she said quickly, before she could stop herself. Sable turned toward her with an expression of practiced sympathy that felt entirely hollow. "I understand this is difficult to hear, but the servant was quite specific in her account. She claims to have seen you near your mother's old belongings shortly after the sickness took her, my king, long before you would have had any official reason to be there." "I was a child then," Ren said, her voice steady despite the anger building beneath her calm exterior. "I would have been no older than 7 or 8 years old at the time. I didn't even work at the schoolhouse until years later." "Perhaps memory serves differently for a servant recalling events from long ago," Sable said smoothly. Though the accusation itself seemed worth bringing before the king, given how much weight has apparently been placed on this drawing's origin. Kale's expression remained carefully controlled, though Ren could see the tension building in the set of his jaw, the same tension she had noticed when news arrived about the Northern Riders days earlier. "Who is this servant?" Kale asked. "I would like to speak with her directly." Sable hesitated, just slightly, though it was enough for Ren to notice. "She wished to remain unnamed, my king, fearing consequences for coming forward with such a sensitive claim." "An unnamed accusation," Kale said slowly, "against a woman who has done nothing since arriving at this keep except answer honestly whenever I've asked her something." His eyes met Sable's directly. "That seems like a thin foundation for such a serious claim, Lady Sable. I only wish to protect your interest, my king. If this drawing was obtained dishonestly, it would reflect poorly on the crown to have accepted it so publicly during the ceremony." "I appreciate your concern," Kale said, his tone carrying an edge that had not been present moments earlier. "I will look into the matter myself, thoroughly, and I expect whoever brought this accusation to you will be willing to repeat it directly to me, should it prove true." Sable's composure flickered for just a moment before settling back into place. "Of course, my king. I only meant to bring the matter to your attention." After she left the chamber, the tension in the room did not ease, and Ren found herself sitting quietly across from Kale, her hands trembling slightly despite her efforts to remain composed. "I promise you," she said, "everything I told you about that drawing was true. I found it in the storage closet years after your mother passed, tucked inside that old storybook, exactly as I described." "I believe you," Kale said firmly, though the weight of the accusation clearly still troubled him. "But belief alone won't be enough to satisfy the court, especially once word of this spreads, and it will spread, whether Sable intended it publicly or not." "What do we do?" "We find the truth," Kale said, rising from his chair with renewed determination. "Not through rumors and unnamed servants, but through people who actually know what happened." Over the following 2 days, Kale conducted his own quiet investigation, moving through the outer village with only a small, trusted escort rather than announcing his presence with the usual formality of a king's visit. He spoke first with Clara Whitfield, who confirmed that Ren had joined the schoolhouse cleaning duties only 6 years earlier, well after the timeline Sable's mysterious servant had described. He then sought out the older villagers who had lived near the schoolhouse during the years following his mother's death, and one by one, their accounts painted a picture entirely different from the one Sable had presented. Several remembered a young Ren Calder growing up in a modest home at the edge of the village, the daughter of a woodcutter and a seamstress, both of whom had passed away from illness themselves when Ren was still a teenager, leaving her to support herself through whatever honest work she could find. She spent years tending to the sick in this village, one elderly woman told Kale, her voice carrying genuine warmth as she spoke. My own husband might not have survived his fever last winter without her care. She never asked for payment beyond what we could spare, and often she asked for nothing at all. Another villager, a farmer whose young son had broken his leg the previous spring, spoke of how Ren had worked nearly 2 hours each day for 3 weeks straight to check on the boy's recovery, refusing to accept any additional coin beyond what the family had already offered for her initial treatment. She's the kind of person who gives more than she takes, the farmer said simply. Always has been, since she was a girl herself. By the time Kale returned to the keep, he carried with him not only confirmation that Sebo's accusation was baseless, but a far deeper understanding of the woman who had walked into his throne hall with nothing but an old drawing and a quiet honesty that had cracked open something in him he thought had long since closed. He also carried something else. During his conversations in the village, one of the older women mentioned, almost in passing, that she had once seen a young servant girl matching Sebo's description asking pointed questions near the schoolhouse only a week earlier, offering coin in exchange for anyone willing to speak poorly of Ren Calder. Armed with this information, Kale called for a formal gathering of the court elders the following morning, a rare occurrence outside of major ceremonies, and one that immediately signaled to everyone present that something significant was about to unfold. Lady Sebo arrived with the same composed confidence she always carried, though Ren, standing quietly near the side of the hall at Kale's request, noticed a flicker of unease crossing her features when she saw the gathered elders and the serious expression on the king's face. I have spent the past 2 days investigating the accusation brought before me regarding the origin of a certain drawing, Kale announced, his voice carrying clearly through the hall. I want to share what I have found. He recounted his conversations with Clara Whitfield, with the elderly villagers, with the farmer whose son Ren had cared for without compensation, painting a clear and consistent picture of a woman who had spent her entire adult life serving others quietly, without recognition, without reward beyond the simple satisfaction of helping those in need. I also discovered, Kale continued, his eyes moving deliberately toward Lady Sebo, that a servant matching a very specific description was seen in the village recently, offering payment to anyone willing to speak against Miss Calder's character. A ripple of shocked whispers moved through the gathered elders, and Sebo's composure finally cracked, just slightly, her jaw tightening as she realized the direction the conversation had taken. My king, I don't know what you're suggesting. I'm not suggesting anything, Lady Sebo, Kale said, his voice cold and steady. I'm stating what I found through my own inquiry. The accusation brought to me 2 days ago has no foundation in truth. The timeline doesn't match, the witness cannot be named, and evidence suggests an active attempt to manufacture doubt where none should exist. Sebo's face had gone pale, though she straightened her shoulders, attempting to salvage whatever dignity remained available to her. I only wish to protect the integrity of the crown, my king. If I was misled by false information, I apologize for bringing it forward without fuller confirmation. Perhaps, Kale said, though his tone made clear he did not fully accept her explanation. I would advise, going forward, that any concerns regarding this court be brought to me with proper evidence, rather than unnamed accusations designed to damage someone's reputation without accountability. The elders exchanged uneasy glances, several of them clearly reconsidering their earlier skepticism toward Ren now that the truth of the matter had been laid out so plainly before them. Elder Garrick, in particular, studied Ren with an expression that had shifted noticeably from doubt toward something closer to respect. As the gathering dispersed, Sebo left the hall quickly, her earlier confidence replaced by a controlled anger that promised, Ren suspected, further complications in the days ahead, though for now, at least, the immediate threat had been addressed. Kale found Ren near the edge of the hall once the room had emptied, his expression carrying both relief and something deeper, something that had grown steadily since the moment she first stepped forward with nothing but a folded piece of paper in her hands. I'm sorry you had to endure that, he said quietly. You didn't have to defend me the way you did, Ren replied, still processing everything that had unfolded. You could have simply dismissed the accusation privately. I wanted the truth known publicly, Kale said firmly. Not just for your sake, though that mattered greatly to me, but because I refused to let fear and false claims dictate what happens in this court. My father built his rule on control and suspicion. I don't intend to build mine the same way. Ren studied his face carefully, seeing not just the king who had stood before the elders moments earlier, but the same man who had sat quietly in a private chamber days before, holding a child's drawing with trembling hands, grieving a mother he'd never been allowed to properly mourn. "Thank you," she said simply, "for believing me, and for proving it." "Always," Cale said, and the word carried a weight that neither of them fully addressed yet, though both understood, in that quiet moment, that whatever had begun between them was no longer something either of them intended to walk away from easily. Word of the gathering spread through the keep just as quickly as the earlier rumors had, though this time the story carried a different weight entirely. Servants whispered about how the king himself had walked through the village to uncover the truth, how he had stood before the elders and dismantled Lady Sable's accusation piece by piece, how his voice had carried an authority none of them had heard from him since his coronation. For Wren, the days following the gathering passed in a strange, unfamiliar rhythm. She continued her work at Clara's cottage, tending to the sick and injured of the outer village as she always had, though now she did so under the watchful curiosity of neighbors who had heard the stories and wanted to see for themselves whether the healer's apprentice who had captured the king's attention was truly as ordinary as she appeared. "You've become quite the topic of conversation," Clara said one evening, watching Wren grind herbs at the small work table near the cottage window. "I never wanted to be," Wren replied honestly. "I only wanted to return something that didn't belong to me." "I know, child. But sometimes the smallest actions carry the largest consequences, whether we intend them to or not." 3 days after the gathering, another summons arrived from the keep, though this one felt different from the quiet notes Cale had sent before. This message came through an official messenger, sealed with the royal crest, requesting Wren's presence at a formal feast to be held within the week, an event the messenger explained would mark the official conclusion of the choosing ceremony that had been interrupted weeks earlier. Clara read the message over Wren's shoulder, her expression tightening with a mixture of hope and worry. "This is it," she said quietly. "Whatever he intends to announce, it seems he intends to do it publicly, before the entire court." Wren felt her stomach tighten with nervous anticipation, uncertain what the coming days would bring, though something in her heart, quiet but persistent, suggested that everything building between her and Cale over these past weeks had been leading toward exactly this moment. The days leading up to the feast passed both too quickly and too slowly, filled with equal parts anticipation and dread. Word had spread throughout the entire territory that the king intended to make a significant announcement, and nobles from across the Ashgrove lands began arriving at the keep in growing numbers, filling the halls with silk and jewelry and quiet, calculating conversations about what the announcement might mean for their own ambitions. Lady Sable remained at the keep as well, though her presence had shifted noticeably since the gathering. She moved through the halls with careful restraint now, her earlier confidence replaced by a watchful caution, though Wren could still sense the simmering resentment beneath her polished exterior whenever their paths crossed. On the evening of the feast, Wren stood in a small chamber prepared for her by the keep staff, staring at her reflection in a modest mirror while an attendant helped fasten the simple, elegant gown Cale had sent for her to wear, a soft blue fabric far less extravagant than the gowns worn by the noble daughters, but chosen, the attendant explained, specifically because Cale had requested something that reflected who Wren actually was rather than who the court expected her to become. "He asked for something simple," the attendant said, smoothing the fabric gently. "He said extravagance never suited the people who mattered most." Wren touched the fabric carefully, feeling a wave of emotion she couldn't quite name settle over her. When she finally entered the great hall, the space had been transformed entirely from the ceremony weeks earlier. Long tables stretched along the walls, filled with food and drink, while musicians played softly near the far corner, and hundreds of candles cast warm, golden light across the gathered crowd of nobles, elders, and curious onlookers who had traveled from across the territory to witness whatever announcement the king intended to make. Cale stood near the throne at the front of the hall, dressed in formal robes that matched the gravity of the occasion, though his eyes found Wren almost immediately as she entered, and something in his expression softened despite the weight of ceremony surrounding them both. The crowd parted slightly as she made her way toward the front of the hall, whispers following her path, some curious, some skeptical, a few openly disdainful, though Wren kept her focus steady, remembering Clara's words about consequences and choices, remembering the honest conversations she had shared with Cale in the quiet chamber and the peaceful garden, remembering that whatever happened tonight, she had done nothing except tell the truth from the very beginning. Once she reached the front of the hall, Cale raised his hand, and the musicians fell silent, the murmuring crowd gradually quieting as well until the entire hall waited in anticipation for the king to speak. Weeks ago, Cale began, his voice carrying clearly through the vast space. 12 noble daughters stood before me in this very hall, each one offering gifts meant to demonstrate their worth as a future queen. Silk finer than anything I had seen before. Gold enough to fill the treasury for years. Promises of grain, of soldiers, of alliances that would strengthen this territory for generations to come. He paused, his eyes moving across the gathered crowd before settling once more on Ren. Each gift was valuable. Each offer was generous. And yet, sitting on that throne, listening to promise after promise, I felt nothing but the same hollow weight I've carried since the day I became king, the weight of being valued for my title rather than for who I actually am. A quiet murmur passed through the hall, though Cale continued without pause. Then a woman stepped forward with nothing but a folded piece of paper, a child's drawing made 20 years ago, a drawing I had forgotten existed, a drawing that connected me to a mother I lost far too young and a childhood my own father tried to erase in the name of strength. His voice grew quieter, though it carried no less weight for the change. She didn't know what that drawing would mean to me when she found it. She only knew it belonged to someone, and she believed it deserved to be returned. He stepped down from the raised platform where the throne sat, walking slowly toward Ren as the entire hall watched in absolute silence. In the weeks since, I have come to understand something I should have recognized far sooner. A crown surrounded by silk and gold can still feel entirely empty. But a single honest conversation, a single act of quiet kindness asking nothing in return, can fill that emptiness in ways no treasury ever could. He reached into the inner pocket of his robe and withdrew the folded drawing, now carefully preserved, and held it up for the gathered court to see, the faded crayon lines visible even from a distance. This is the only gift I have ever received in this hall that I intend to keep for the rest of my life. And the woman who gave it to me is the only person I intend to stand beside as queen of this territory. Gasps rippled through the crowd, some of shock, some of quiet approval, though Sable's expression, visible near the front of the gathered nobles, had gone rigid with barely controlled fury. Cale turned to face Ren directly, his eyes carrying none of the careful distance he maintained during official court matters, only the same honest warmth she had witnessed in the private chamber weeks earlier. Ren Calder, he said, his voice steady despite the weight of the moment, you came to this hall offering nothing but truth, and in doing so, you gave me back a piece of myself I thought had been lost forever. I would be honored, more than any title or treasure could ever express, if you would stand beside me not as a political arrangement, but as someone I have genuinely come to care for. Ren felt tears gathering at the corners of her eyes, though she kept her voice steady when she finally spoke. I never expected anything beyond returning what belonged to you, she said softly. But these past weeks have shown me something I didn't expect to find in a place filled with so much silk and gold. I would be honored to stand beside you, Cale, not as a queen chosen for political gain, but as someone who has come to care for you just as deeply. The hall erupted into a mixture of applause and murmured astonishment, the elders exchanging glances that ranged from surprised approval to lingering uncertainty, though Elder Garrick, standing near the front of the gathered crowd, nodded slowly with quiet satisfaction, as though he had suspected this outcome since the moment Ren first stepped forward at the original ceremony. In the weeks that followed, the transition was not without difficulty. Several noble families withdrew their support briefly, unhappy that political alliances they had hoped to secure through marriage had been set aside in favor of what many considered an unconventional choice. Lady Sable left the territory entirely within a month, her ambitions thoroughly dismantled, though rumors persisted that she continued searching for opportunities elsewhere to rebuild her influence. But slowly, gradually, the pack began to accept Ren, not because of any grand gesture or display of wealth, but because of the same quiet consistency that had defined her entire life. She continued visiting the outer village regularly, tending to the sick alongside Clara whenever her new duties allowed, refusing to abandon the work that had shaped who she was long before she ever stepped into a royal hall. The northern border situation, which had loomed over the early days of their courtship, eventually resolved itself through careful diplomacy rather than conflict. The scouting riders revealed to be part of a neighboring territory testing boundaries after a change in their own leadership, a matter Cale handled with the same steady determination he brought to every challenge, proving to the elders that his judgment, while shaped by compassion, remained no less sharp for it. On a quiet afternoon several months after the feast, Kale led Ren to a small clearing behind the keep, carrying a young oak sapling carefully wrapped at its roots. "I want to plant this here," he said, kneeling down to dig a small hole in the soft earth, in memory of my mother, and the tree she used to read beneath. I think she would have liked knowing there was a new one growing, somewhere close to home. Ren knelt beside him, helping steady the small tree as he settled it into the ground, packing the soil carefully around its roots. "It will take years to grow crooked and strong like the one in your drawing," she said softly. "I have time," Kale replied, glancing up at her with a smile that carried none of the careful distance he once maintained, only the quiet warmth of a man who had finally found something worth more than any crown. "And I intend to spend it here, watching it grow, with you beside me." As the sun set slowly behind the ash grove hills, casting long golden light across the small sapling and the two figures kneeling beside it, the keep behind them stood quiet and steady, no longer weighed down by empty ceremony and hollow promises, but filled instead with something far simpler and far more enduring, a single act of honesty that had, against every expectation, changed the course of an entire kingdom.